Welcome to Personal Landscapes. I'm your host, Ryan Murdoch. You can find links for today's episode and other conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. Julian Evans first visited the city of Odesa on a boat journey down the Dnipro River in 1994. He fell in love with its distinct personality as a self-contained world, and he also fell in love with a local woman. For nearly 30 years, her city became his city too. When Russia invaded in 2022, he went back with a donated pickup truck and boxes of tourniquets to do his part for his adopted homeland. His eyewitness account of life under bombardment weaves memoir with history and literature to give us a haunting portrait of a country struggling against terrible odds to survive. Julian is the author of Undefeatable, Odesa in Love and War, and of Semi-Invisible Man, The Life of Norman Lewis, which was the topic of episode 20 of this podcast. We spoke about the city of Odesa, his visits to frontline combat zones, and what Russia's war means for Europe. One quick note before we jump in. You've heard me mention on previous episodes that I have a new book out this year called A Sunny Place for Shady People. I'm not going to pitch you again this week. Instead, I'll tell you what one of my favorite writers, Paul Theroux, said about it in a recent email. He said, "I finished A Sunny Place and I greatly admire it. As a destination to write an affectionate Durrellian tribute to, probably the worst choice on earth. As a subject for a book, absolutely great. I think whenever the subject of Malta arises, your book will be referenced. I was struck by how just about everyone in power seemed to have been involved in Daphne's murder. Your untangling the whole business was masterful and persuasive, and one ends with the impression that the entire island is cursed. Such wicked places produce rebellious, clear-sighted, singular people like Daphne, just a few pearls and all the grit, and good books like yours, because instead of fleeing, you stayed the course and wrote about it." A Sunny Place for Shady People is published by Trinity University Press in the US and Europe and Australia, and in a new paperback edition by Mid-Sea Books in Malta. I hope you'll check it out. And now, here's my conversation with Julian Evans. I knew you had a long personal history with Ukraine, but I didn't realize how far back it went. So when and why did you first go there?
Well, it was an interesting story to me anyway, because it was one of those kind of literary serendipity things that that happened in the 1990s, in the mid 1990s, and I was reading some stories by Bruce Chatwin, and there's a story he wrote about a boat trip down the Volga. And I was really interested in Eastern Europe at that time. I'd made a few trips to Russia and I think one to the Crimea by then. And I thought, well, I can't do that again. But let's see if there are any other great river trips that are waiting nearby. You know, I thought about the Danube and then realized that Claudia Magris had written a fantastic book about that. And then I discovered the Dnipro River trip, now Dnipro River. And so I booked myself a place on this riverboat going downstream from Kiev to the Black Sea. And Odesa didn't really feature on the itinerary. It was just the last stop. The whole trip was billed as Kiev to the Black Sea and Yalta particularly. So, you know, you'd end up in the sort of beautiful Crimea. And so it was a bit of a surprise when we'd done all the beautiful Crimea, and it was indeed very beautiful. And then we chugged back across the Black Sea. And these riverboats aren't really made for seagoing because in order to go down the river, they have very flat hull. So we were sort of slipping and sliding across the Black Sea, and then late in the afternoon, this vision became more and more precise out of the distance, and I must have had the best possible vista for arrival in the city, because the sea station is right at the bottom it's in the middle of the docks, right at the bottom of the Potemkin stairs. And so looking up and getting into sharper and sharper focus, you saw the top of the stairs and Primorsky Boulevard, this beautiful chestnut planted boulevard with the merchants' houses behind it, and this lovely big crescent in the middle with the statue of the Duke of Richelieu, who was the first governor of the city. And as I walked up, it was just like, it really was like sort of walking into a dream. The architecture is magnificent. The city was built as a kind of a boom town from the beginning, and so it's all in that part, that old part of the city. It's all 19th century neoclassical architecture, built by Italians and Greeks, Italian masons, Greek carpenters, and architected by Italians and French. And so it's a bit like Haussmann's Paris before Haussmann got round to it, but even more fanciful and ornamental and beautifully decorated in these huge wide streets. It was just fabulous. It was like stepping through the back of a wardrobe.
And those are some of the most lyrical sections of your book as well. Your descriptions of the city and the character of the city really gripped me. You described Odesa as somewhere where the boundaries between the actual and the imaginary world, between stony reality and charming performance, between survival and daydreams and facts and desires were continually blurring. This sort of self-contained world that's almost like a stage set and the people are performers. Could you say more about the feel of the place?
Yeah, I mean that's almost a kind of unintentional thing to begin with, because after the communist period, 74 years of basically neglect, you had to imagine it in its heyday. You could see these buildings, but there were many of them half falling down, and within that sort of slightly crumbling stage set of an old city, you had people who were perforce having to improvise their existences because of lack of opportunities, corruption, lack of money, and so people were play acting at being themselves, and in a funny way, being in some ways a better version of themselves, because they kind of had enough to eat. I'm not over romanticizing. People did have enough to eat. A lot of people were very poor, but Odessa people and Ukrainians in general, very sharing, helpful people. So they had enough to eat, but they didn't have much to call luxury. And so I guess what happened was that they were improvising their lives to make them more exciting than they were, and that led to all kinds of dreaming as well, how life might be. And I'm sure that when I met my future wife 5 years later, I think there was an element of that for both of us. I mean, I'd fallen in love with the city, and she perhaps in part fell in love with the idea of a life beyond, working fantastically long hours as a waitress just to find some time to do her painting.
That's a really interesting observation that you're you kind of get drawn into this performative aspect of the city, and how you fall in love with an idea almost as much as a person, especially these kind of cross-cultural relationships where you sometimes, at least for me, when I met my wife in university time, I'm sure she didn't understand half of what I was saying back then, and that kind of worked to my advantage. But
can I just say one other thing to sort of kind of try and scotch this over romanticizing thing that people might hear in what I'm saying? It's also a very musical city. It's a very artistic city. That people performing, everybody could either play a musical instrument or draw, and that's actually very common across Ukraine. And that they're culturally embedded in music and art, but especially in Odessa towards performative music. And we know that George Gershwin's parents came from Odessa. Serge Gainsbourg's father and grandfather came from Odessa. Bob Dylan's grandparents left in the 1905 pogrom. Very, very musical city.
And writers as well. There are quite a number of
Isaac Babel is the most famous one for sort of mythologizing the kind of Jewish slash criminal part of Odessa in his Odessa stories. And he gives a wonderful account of what the early criminal life in Odessa must have been. But there are others too. Anna Akhmatova, the great poet, was born just outside Odessa. The city was full of poets. There were, Ilfin Petrov, who wrote the 12 Chairs, were born in Odessa. A lot of the literature reflected the life of the city too, which was not only sort of booming in art and romance, but also in criminality. It was a free port, and so there was a hell of a lot. I mean, it was a very big port, and a hell of a lot of smuggling went on, an awful lot of criminality, and criminality because people, had to find ways to earn a living, and sometimes there wasn't a legal way to earn a living.
So you mentioned one of the core narrative threads of your book, which is a memoir about your courtship, marriage, and eventual divorce. Why did you feel it was important to include this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's one that I thought about a lot. The book came about because I felt that I needed to be in the city, at least for some time during the war, to see what it felt like. I mean, in England, I just felt too safe. I felt as if I wasn't really where I belonged. I've been living in Odessa and going to Odessa for 25 years, and when I got there, I didn't really. I had an idea that I'd like to write something about it, but there wasn't a shape to it. There wasn't a structure to the story. When I got there, I was just very struck instantly by the feeling that all of my memories were in jeopardy. That this must be something that Ukrainians feel. That everything that they loved and held dear about their lives is just teetering on the brink of destruction. And I thought, well, if I'm going to write a book, I better capture those memories. And also, if I do that, it might get away from me writing another relatively well-informed take about Odessa and Ukraine and the war and politics, and basically telling for an English audience what the Ukrainians were going through. And I thought, well, why not say what I went through over those 25 years in as interesting a way as I can, and let readers experience the situation from that perspective, which is a little bit different from a lot of the books that have been published about Ukraine. And gosh, there have been a lot, and very good ones. So then I thought, I'll just take a risk and I'll make it as personal as possible, because I know people like personal stories.
And you really put a personal stamp on current events and established your rich and deep history and connection to this place. It must have been really difficult to write, but also your marriage itself. Like, you didn't just have to overcome bureaucratic hurdles to make this marriage happen. You had to convert and be baptized.
Yeah, I didn't have to. I mean, it did feel like a problem at some point, because Natasha was Orthodox, is Orthodox, and it sort of crept up on me, because she's not the kind of woman to spell things out and tell me what I had to do. She left me to work it out for myself. But I began to realize that this was very important to her, and I had no religion at all, and I mean, I had been baptized Methodist by my parents, but I was the most lapsed Methodist you can possibly imagine, and so we had a discussion, and she, without going into huge detail, she convinced me. And if you want to know more, it's in the book. It is quite an interesting kind of twist of fate. She actually changed my life in that respect, and I did get christened in the church, and the Orthodox Church is very practical. The liturgies are long. It's okay if you nip out for a fag in the middle of it. If you need the priest to do something, they'll do their very best to help. They're not too held back by kind of doctrinal restrictions. So I was christened and married within, I think, 4 days.
Wow.
And so that all worked very well. And it was a compensation for having to spend so much time and energy circumventing the Ukrainian bureaucracy.
Well, you're remarkably successful. I mean, you got married in a monastery, which is quite an unusual choice.
Yes, that's the big monastery opposite the main railway station, Saint Pantelemon's, and Natasha's. It was Natasha's local church. I mean, there were masses there every Sunday, sometimes every Saturday, and in the week as well. So it was natural that we'd go and talk to her priest, who happened to be the archimandrite of the monastery, and I said to Natasha, well, will you ask him if he'll marry us? And because I'd asked outright, he couldn't really refuse. That would have been going against the Orthodox idea that you help people. But it was actually the first wedding that had ever taken, first marriage ceremony that had ever taken place in the monastery in 100 years. And I think it may be the last as well.
That's amazing. So I want to ask you about some of the divisions between Russia and Ukraine and the divisions within Ukraine. So you traveled to Russia in the 90s, as you said, and Ukraine felt different. Could you say more about that difference for those who haven't traveled to either country?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I had a fairly good opportunity to compare the two, because I think my nearest trip to Russia was a trip I made in 1992, and then I first went to Ukraine in 1994. So pretty close in terms of time, and there was a massive difference in two respects. One was that both countries were sort of on their knees after the collapse of communism, and and the galloping gangster states that set themselves up in the wake of that. And yet, the feeling I had was that Ukraine was a much lighter, brighter country. It wasn't so mouldering. And it wasn't so dark, and nor were the people. And I think that's probably where the sensation came from. The Russian spirit is one of deep Dostoevskian, I would say, a sense of greatness and tragedy at the same time. Whereas in Ukraine, there was much more of a sense of cheerful, relatively easygoing, slightly more European way of looking at life. And it's interesting because this makes Russians tend to think, if I can generalize wildly, and I'll try not to do that too much while we're talking, but it's always struck me that Russians tend to regard Ukrainians as soft. And I think this is one of the huge ironies that Russia has been forced to face up to in this war, which is that Ukraine's military achievement in defending the country against Russia's aggression has been one of the most stunning in modern history. So I think we can lose the idea of Ukrainians being soft, but on the other hand, they are warm and gentle and funny people, and you add to that the kind of the color and the flash and the general air of relaxation that you get in Odesa, and it's a potently attractive mix.
So some more of those differences came out in your description of the 2004 Orange Revolution. You said it's usually written up as a popular protest against a debauched presidential election, but it was also a straight fight between Ukrainian disobedience and Russian docility, as though the Kremlin assumed that the sort of vote rigging tactics that work in Russia would work in Ukraine too. And you see this as a fundamental misunderstanding of the Ukrainian people.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that if we go back, I don't know, more than 1,000 years, Kiev Rus, from which Ukraine really grew, was an extraordinarily advanced state, but for about 400 years up to 1990, it had been overtaken and annexed and occupied, and had been indeed part of the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Empire. And it had, I think, very little idea of what it meant to be a nation. And I think that that's what grew up over the last 30 years. That's what I think I was lucky enough to witness. In the 90s, it was a little bit wandering and wobbling, and that was okay because Russia was too. So there wasn't much strife between them. But that sort of the corruption and the gangster state that developed in both countries was strongly reacted against by Ukrainians increasingly from about 2000 onwards. There were these protests, Ukraine without Kuchma, who was then the president of Ukraine, and the one who had really imported the whole oligarchic system into the country. And then in 2004, the Orange Revolution was a stronger expression of that. And then I think by 2013, when the Maidan protest started, that was an even stronger expression of their desire to say, we are a nation. We will not be under the thumb or the fist of another country, especially not Russia. And Russians don't have this. I mean, in 2011, 2012, of course, there were quite big demonstrations in Russia. Putin at that stage was moving towards president for life, and he basically fixed those elections, and people knew in Russia. But they were quashed, and the demonstrations were squashed, and that was that. There's never really been a strong opposition since. But the Ukrainians have always had that building, that developing spirit of protest that they actually want now to have a nation, which is why they're fighting this war. You know, it's the sort of total authentication of their desire to be a nation, so their willingness to fight this war, have these losses, make these sacrifices.
It's also a massive country. And so it's not surprising that there are differences and divisions within it. But you said before Putin started his war in 2014, the main division in Ukraine was not between Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers or nationalists and non-nationalists, but it was between the super wealthy and the working people.
I think it's fair to say that we're not talking about a country now that is free of corruption. But I think back then, the parliament was rigged with MPs who'd bought their supporters' votes. A lot of oligarchs sat in parliament. I mean, when I met Natasha, her family, in a funny way, sort of represented Ukraine as a nation as it was then, because her father was a pretty well-known and important wheat scientist, which is a very important job in Ukraine. And she had a cousin who was number 2 in one of the Crimean mafia gangs. And he, along with other oligarchic stroke, perhaps less than legal characters, always saw their ultimate legitimization as becoming an MP. So you've got this quite strong cloud of corruption or corrupt ways hanging over the whole idea of Ukrainian democracy. And I think that the impulses that produced that also produced the oligarchs who really only cared about their fiefdoms and making more money. And although they paid their supporters and they did these sort of goodwill gestures, like football stadiums and building roads, never did anything to, for example, improve conditions in the mines, in the steelworks, which were very important in East Ukraine. And, general quality of life was really poor. So it was really, of course, there are always differences. There's there are differences here in the UK, North and South, all the countries of the Union, there are always differences. But the really big difference was that the super wealthy were getting away with everything and other people weren't. And Russia exploited that.
So let's talk about the current war, the central thread of your book, and something that's on all of our minds. So we should start by putting the 2022 invasion into context. Ukraine wasn't the first stage of what in hindsight looks like a much larger plan. Like Putin's tanks actually rolled into Georgia in 2008.
Yes. And I mean, before that, he'd fought 2 wars in Chechnya. I think we in the West completely dropped the ball about Putin, and we probably conclusively dropped it well before Ukraine, during the Georgia invasion. But then when Putin when he occupied Crimea and annexed Crimea and occupied the Donbass, we should have done much more. We should have seen that this was a post-war nation, modern nation, a superpower, willing to use violence to achieve political ends. And the countries that he was beginning to attack were not satellites of the Soviet Union. I mean, I think somehow we had a sort of neural pathway that said, oh, yes, this is just something happening in the Russian sphere of interest. But they weren't. These were sovereign nations. It had all been agreed. Everybody signed it off in the 1990s. And we just didn't see that there was this, well, I call it a smoldering garbage fire. It hadn't really burst into flames, but it was already heating up. And we just ignored it. We just pretended it wasn't happening. And so we let it develop up to the point where in 2022, Putin decided that he was going to go for broke, reintroduce Ukraine into the Russian Empire.
So how much responsibility does the West bear for that war? Like, we hear a lot of people saying that NATO enlargement provoked Putin. I tend to think that weak Western leaders failing to react to the exact situation you described was more of an encouragement, that you let somebody keep getting away with something and then just take a little more.
Yes, and I think that will continue to happen if we don't stand up and stop it now. I think it's important to think of the whole notion of empire. I mean, these are very complicated questions, but I think it's beyond doubt that the 19th and early 20th century, which was the age of empire, caused an enormous amount of bloodshed and harm. And the end of those empires and the beginning of integration between the nations which possessed those empires has given us 80 years of peace. And Russia as an empire is like every other empire. It has a center, but it has no borders. Empires don't have borders. They just keep seeking to expand. And we've never fully taken that into our consideration of how we should react to Russia. It's all very well to develop a defensive alliance like NATO, but if you don't have the political will that goes hand in hand with that, then you will always have the situation that we have had since 2014 with Russia, in which you're not really reacting. And so he's going further each time, as you say. And if we don't do it now, he will go on. And in fact, he is already, without waging out and out war, he's already doing it in Western Europe, doing it in the USA, interfering with elections, paying right wing conservatives to amplify their voices, handing over sabotage and subversion jobs to criminal proxies, which have led to arson attacks and the jamming of GPS signals and the breaking of underwater cables, and all those things. And we're kind of still letting him get away with it. And I think if you look what happened in Syria, for example, and if you look at what's happening in Africa, everywhere you look, where there is disruption and chaos, in the Middle East also, between Israel and Hamas, you will find a very big pile of rubles sitting nearby.
So you said you believe that Putin's war aims always included Odessa. Why? Is that to connect up Transnistria?
Yeah, I think he thought that he could fatally weaken Ukraine by landlocking it, by making that land corridor that started at Mariupol and went down to the Crimean Peninsula and extending it to Odessa and joining up with Transnistria, ready for an occupation of Moldova in the future. And it was a very good thing that he wasn't allowed to do that by some heroic resistance in Mykolaiv and in the country around it, because you can imagine that if he had got hold of Odessa, Ukraine's situation would have become very perilous.
So I want to talk about some of that resistance, actually. You paint a really vivid picture of Odessa at war, of staying in a hotel with no heat or electricity, having to go up the outside fire escape to get to your room. And one of the things that really struck me about those opening descriptions of your book was the ingenuity of the people and their stoicism and how they were coping with this. Is that sense of stoicism, that ability to kind of cobble together solutions, is that an innate part of the Ukrainian character, or is that a consequence of having lived for so long under communism, in Soviet times, or both, maybe?
Yeah, another good question. And I think you're right. I think it is both. I think they're very resourceful people. They will find workarounds to an awful lot of situations. And by the way, you can look at that resourcefulness as it's expressed in the way they've developed their own homemade weapons. Having failed to be supplied with enough Western weapons, they've done an extraordinary job of, single-handedly advancing the aerial, marine, and other drone industries by leaps and bounds, just through their own ingenuity and determination. So, yeah, resourceful in their acts and the way they cope with difficult situations. They make alliances with each other. They don't give up. They have a sense of humor about it. Again, I hate the idea that people would think I'm romanticizing them. People just making a day every day under bombardment it's pretty exhilarating to watch. And I'm very aware that I have always got a ticket home whenever I want to go.
But you also went back again and again. You delivered what, two trucks that you took down there full of tourniquets and medical supplies. I mean,
Yes, I mean, the odd thing is that as soon as I came back, I wanted to go again. And when I was unable to be there, I have spent my time doing as much as I can, fundraising and taking four-wheel drives down to Odessa, to usually full of medical equipment and other bits and pieces um, that they need, winter uniforms and so on. And it's a drop in the ocean. It's an absolute drop in the ocean. But I think it's good for morale, and it's good for their morale. They seem to appreciate it enormously. They appreciate above all the signs that people haven't forgotten them. And so if you can show that in a practical way, that that touches them, and then you get called all sorts of stupid things like a hero when they're raising their glasses and all that. And of course it's not, but they are so touched by the fact that you haven't forgotten them. And I think that's the big problem with what we've failed to do, with the military aid. We've left them to take on the Russian army and now the North Korean army completely on their own.
so you've visited the front lines several times over the years, with combat medics and with drone operators, and these are some of the most vivid scenes in the book. Could you give us a sense of what that experience was like? These people that are fighting the Russian army with the full might of the Russian army with improvised weaponry. That's really amazing.
I suppose it has to be seen against a background of, in the beginning, them not wanting to fight the Russians at all. In 2014, it was very difficult to persuade Ukrainians to shoot their rifles at Russians. And it was only when Russians made it very clear that they wanted to kill Ukrainians that they gradually adapted to that. It wasn't in their DNA. I've seen some really odd word to use, but some really fun improvised weapons, driven by Ukrainians who would go into a village with a cheap old pickup full of cabbages on the back seat to deliver to the villagers to keep them fed, and on the back window there'd be a machine gun, and when they got to the village, they'd start firing at a position and then just get out of there as fast as they could, because all they wanted to do was draw the fire, and then go back and tell the guys a few hundred yards away where the troops were and where they should be sending their mortars and shells. So there was a lot of improvisation, and there still is. I mean, the improvisation is a bit more sophisticated now. They're using 3D printers and so on, but everybody is playing a part. There's a huge volunteer community. I mean, all the families who aren't fighting on the front are, as we did in the Second World War, but possibly even more so. They're knitting, they're sending food, they're providing all the backup they possibly can. And this has meant that actually you've had a whole nation mobilized, and this has made a huge difference. But they are getting very, very tired.
So I just have two last questions for you. I know you've got a dinner tonight to go to. I want to ask you, I found this really interesting. You've got a long quote in the book where you say that, commentators have said this invasion was Putin's last throw of the dice, an attempt to pull together or recreate the USSR. Or they've said it's a well-planned act of criminal military aggression, or an impulsive, expansionist act to recover lost territory, or a reaction against the decadent West. And you disagreed. You said it was none of those things. The truth, you say, is that Putin's unprovoked invasion of and war against Ukraine are a Russian habit. If there's one way to understand Russia's behavior as an empire, it's through a habit of punishment. That's a really interesting observation. Could you say more about that?
That's the way I've seen Russia's attitude towards Ukraine over the last 25 or so years. in another way, I don't think it's a terribly original observation, because I think all empires seek to do the same two things, which is physical invasion and aggression, and then assimilation by force. So those two things: you expand violently, and then you assimilate by force. In other words, you say, if you're not with us, then you're nothing, and you're probably dead. And I think out of that, you can get you can draw an explanation of why Russia's done what it's done. But Russia has always punished Ukraine specifically for being Ukraine, or for wanting to be Ukraine. We can see that over the last 100 years. I do provide a few examples, but one of them obviously is the Great Famine that Stalin imposed on the country in 1932-33, in which probably 4 million people died of starvation. And then a few years later, during the purges, the whole Ukrainian Renaissance, so-called, of poets and writers, artists, working within a Ukrainian framework of language and culture, they were all executed. They suffered disproportionately in the purges of the late 30s, and so on. And I think this time around, to me, there's a very strong whiff that Putin is applying a sort of almost counter-revolutionary script, in that he doesn't want Ukraine to become a nation, because it will indicate to Russians that democracy is available as an alternative. And that is very dangerous for Putin himself.
I suppose it also contradicts the this sense of victimhood and being permanently faced by permanently surrounded by enemies intent on your destruction. If that's such an important part of the country's psyche, and loyalty to absolute power and all these things, if you see somebody break away successfully and become a successful, wealthy, modern nation where people are happy and not under someone's thumb, I could see how that would be an example you would not want to encourage.
Yes, and I mean, Russia has always had this reflex of bullying Ukraine, because it's been able to. And what's different now? I mean, I remember seeing the first footage of Russian troops and tanks, and the Ukrainian army were just, they had never expected anything like this to happen. And by the way, this is a nuclear nation. Ukraine was a nuclear nation, and was persuaded to give up its nuclear weapons because it was told there was no threat. It had security guarantees from the US, the UK, France, Germany, and Russia. And so there was a total shock when Russia began in 2014. And yet it was exactly the same. If their memories, if they'd interrogated their memories a little bit more, they could have seen, perhaps, but now we're talking with the benefit of hindsight, that would be how Russia would eventually react.
All right, my final question. You make a strong case in your closing pages for why this fight matters and why it should matter to all of us. Do you think that if Putin wins here, that Moldova, the Baltics, and other countries are next? And what would his success mean for China's Taiwan ambitions?
I think that, yes, he will. Any ceasefire will lead Putin to think that he's got time to rearm, to reorganize, to resupply, and to plan further incursions, certainly into Moldova. And now the Baltics are part of NATO, but what we can see is what is already happening in that respect, in that all this sabotage and subversion that I talked about earlier is already going on. And I think that kind of grey zone war, that hybrid war that he and his alma mater, the KGB, now the FSB, have been so good at pursuing, will continue and intensify. So in a way, he's already doing it. As for China and Taiwan, I think it's up to us to stop Putin doing what he's doing, so that we show to China that it shouldn't do what it may be thinking of doing in occupying Taiwan, annexing Taiwan, invading. I think we can talk a lot about Russia, but we do need to talk about the West's own political weakness in its leadership, because very strong nations, and particularly authoritarian nations, only respond to the strength of their opponents. They don't respond to reasonableness at all.
Yeah, it's a really alarming time. I mean, you don't see any leadership anywhere in the West. I mean, my country is governed by Justin Trudeau's clown show, so that says it all right there. Well, thank you for your time today, Julian, and for writing this important book. I mean, we barely scratched the surface. There's so much in it, from your descriptions of frontline drone operators hiding under plastic sheeting and logs and launching these attacks to the story of your own life in Ukraine and the vivid picture you paint of Odessa. It's a fascinating book and a great read, very lyrical in parts, and I hope listeners will pick it up.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure talking to you, Ryan.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Personal Landscapes. If you like the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes and subscribe through your favorite app. You can find links to today's podcast and more conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. You'll also find a donate button if you'd like to contribute to the costs of the show. All donations are greatly appreciated.